Let us begin preparing for the KSA Science webinar. Welcome, everyone. I'd love to introduce myself and have my wonderful colleague, Julia, introduce herself too. So my name is Brendan Finch, and my pronouns are he, him. You can tweet at me or X at me or whatever at birdbrainfinch. I taught middle and high school science for 7 years in Los Angeles, and I left the classroom to build rocketlit.com. It's our leveled reading website. And we started building in orbit about 5 years ago now, which is awesome. I wrote a lot of the assessments on the site in the beginning, in the early times, and now we have a team of way, way, way more talented people than I writing those assessments, which is fantastic. And I spend a lot of my time now, we're working on some new materials that we'll call beta flexible materials. So think do nows and practice before an assessment where students apply their understanding to a phenomenon in a lower stakes context, or review after an assessment. So we're in a beta pilot stage with some of these, and we're working with some of our partner districts to pilot these things and see how they're working. But you may see some of them on the site in the next, 2 to 5 months, because we're building them out right now. So we have a ton of stuff that we're testing, and so I'm spending a lot of time talking with teachers and administrators about that. And I'm really excited to be joined by my wonderful colleague, Julia. Julia, do you want to introduce yourself too, please?
Of course. So my name is Julia Mota, and I used to be a teacher for elementary students in the Dominican Republic and then a tutor, which was really fun. And I've been building materials to support teachers and districts with the NGSS implementation for the last 2.5 years. And I'm in Orbit's district engagement manager. So if you're interested in piloting or interested in exploring the platform for your school or district, please feel free to shoot me an email and I'll reply. Back to you, Brendan.
Yeah, thank you. And if you're watching this recording, click on the links in the description and you can get started there. But without further ado, let's dive into our agenda for today. So because we're an objective-driven organization, our objective today is to analyze some release test items and dive into some resources and strategies to build scaffolded practice for the KSA and uncover three-dimensional data. We're going to be doing a couple things today. So we will be talking about some KSA released items. We'll talk about three-dimensional standards and how we might scaffold up to those things. And we'll look at inner orbits items and see how those things might be used to scaffold up. We also have some strategies that we've been using over the last year for test prep that have been really well received, and folks have been enjoying those. So using phenomena authority unit, daily do nows, and SCP practice problem. Julia is going to talk about those things. And if you have any questions, please write them in the chat. It's good to see y'all, and we're excited to get started. All right, let's do this. So first is a quick little intro. What is inner orbit? Well, if you don't know what that is, let me tell you really quick. So we do kind of like 3 or 4 things. The first of those is we aggregate phenomena. So we pull together these things that happen in the real world that can be explained with student science knowledge, the SCPs and the cross-cutting concepts, and we package them in these little bite-sized nuggets called clusters with questions. And students can take what they learn in the classroom through some instructional, high quality instructional resources like OpenSciEd, and then they can apply those things to our phenomena to see if they can transfer the knowledge from one place to another. And with those phenomena, we write really scaffolded and detailed questions so that not only are we seeing if students can answer this big, rigorous performance task, but maybe there are small steps and we can measure which place they can get up to and then where they fall off and need additional support. Or if they have a strength, then we can push them to our really, really rigorous questions. And in terms of deciding where students need support and where they have their strengths, our reports detail really specific elements of each of these parts of the standard. So we're not just going to say students are doing well with this group of SCPs or this group of DCIs, but in this SCP, at the 6-8 grade level band, students struggle with developing a model to describe unobservable mechanisms, which is a very, very discrete part of that standard. That way, when you're sitting with your PLC or you're sitting with a student and you're figuring out what you need to do differently to support them or to push them into the next level of understanding, we know exactly where their strengths and where they need additional support. Cool. So with that, let's dive into some item level analysis. And I want to present you with a standard and then 2 different questions. One of these is kind of like, we'll call it an old test item. And then the new one is a KSA question. And I want you to think about the question that I'll pose at the bottom of the slide here. But I want you to think about how we might plan an investigation to determine the relationships among the energy transferred, the type of matter, the mass, and the change in the average kinetic energy of the particles as measured by the temperature of the sample. And so what we're thinking about here are these three dimensions at the bottom: planning, care, and investigations. So students are looking to plan investigation. They need to look at the tools and measurements and how we're going to collect data and use that data to support a claim. And then they need to understand temperature and average kinetic energy, how how that temperature is impacted by these different variables, and also that energy can change. The energy can change the temperature of different things, and that's impacted by a bunch of different variables within that context. And also that there are these proportional relationships between different factors. That's the cross-cutting concept. And so if we look at and compare different proportional relationships between different variables, we can decide, at what degree or what magnitude there will be changes in, one variable as a different one changes. And so with that, I want to dive into two different questions. So first, we're going to look at we'll call this kind of like an old school question. So Sarah is dropping pasta into a pot of boiling water. Which of the following would help us to understand the change in thermal energy of the water when the dry pasta is added? So the answer choices are, we can measure the temperature, observe the pot to see if the water stops boiling. We can observe how much steam is leaving the pot before and after the pasta, or none of these responses will measure the change in thermal energy. So we're just looking at change in thermal energy. And the second question, so this is one of the KSA released items, where there's an investigation that's given, and students have a data table they're looking at, and they're looking at how this heated metal block will change the temperature, or the apparent temperature of this board. And so students are placing a finger on the board, and they're noticing what the temperature feels like at that point. And so we can see how the energy is transferred from this heated metal block to this board or this table or whatever it is. Don't do this on your school tables. It sounds like a good way to wreck stuff. I can see the melted lab tables that existed in my prior classroom from people probably doing things like this. So don't do that. So anyways, the setup that's the setup, and there's a whole data table that's given and an investigation that they go through. And here at the bottom, students are asked to describe how the numbers shown in the model representing particle motion would be different at 5, 10, and 20 minutes after the block was placed on the table. Explain how this model helps to communicate the teacher's claim about particle motion and energy transfer. And really, it's just looking at the fact that energy can be transferred from one place to another. So I think this is a really interesting question, but I'm really excited to hear your thoughts. You can write them in the comments of the video. But what is the difference between these two questions? And also, why is that difference important? As we move on to the next couple slides, we're going to go through our explanation of these things and give you some ideas on how these might be different in case you're not totally sure. And one of the things we see pretty often are questions that look like the first one, except they have like graphs and models and really special things. So they look really three-dimensional. They look really phenomena-driven. Look at this pot boiling water. That's that pot and that boiling water right there. However, in actuality, what this is it's a representation question. So students are representing a piece of knowledge they've discussed before. So the fact that we can understand changes in thermal energy by measuring temperature changes, or the average kinetic energy of the particles in the sample. And what they're not doing is trying to make sense of what's happening to these particles, or why it's occurring, or how these changes could be represented, visually or through evidence. What they're doing is just representing their knowledge, and there's no application here. So sometimes we'll see questions like this where there's a whole phenomena up on top. And this is actually pulled from an old phenomena that was about altitude and the changes in altitude, the changes that occur boiling water at altitude, and cooking pasta was kind of like the phenomena. And it looked like a really three-dimensional question. There was a data table, there were models, there's a whole investigation that somebody went through, and then there was this question. And even though it looked really pretty and it looked really complex, it was in no way a sense-making question. It was just a representation question that had been like painted pretty colors, and that's it. And so that second question, though, is inherently different. So there's a novel and specific phenomena. So something really discrete that students are looking at. They're using that SEP, and in this case, they're actually using modeling, and in prior parts of this question, there's planning, care, and investigations, to apply their understanding of energy transfer at the atomic scale. So using that cross-cutting concept. And so they're leveraging all three dimensions to sort of grapple with this new thing. It's not just, memorizing what is a measure of changes in energy, maybe temperature, but it's an application of this. And these are the phenomenal types of questions that we want to build students up to. But I guess the question is now, so like, how do we get students up to a point where they're able to do that? And so we want to start out by kind of defining what three-dimensional standards are, and then building up towards, ways that we could scaffold students up to that really, really rigorous performance. So what are 3D standards? Well, this is kind of the image that we see oftentimes, or there's like a braided rope to show what 3D standards are. And there are three different dimensions here. So they're the practices and the content and the cross-cutting concepts. The practices are what students do. The content are the DCIs, that's what students know. And the cross-cutting concepts are how students think. So that standard that we looked at earlier had these three things woven into the performance expectation, which is the thing at the top. So students have to understand that the DCI, so they need to know these things, and they need to be able to connect that and apply it through the lens of the science and engineering practice of planning and care and investigations. And in addition, they need to consider and analyze things through the lens of the cross-cutting concept, looking at proportional relationships between different properties and the magnitude of changing those things from like one thing making changes to another. Okay. Great. And so these three-dimensional standards are all baked together in these performance expectations, which is what's at the top here. So plan and investigation, obviously that's planning code investigations, the relationships among the energy transferred, the type of matter, mass, and the change in average kinetic energy as measured by the temperature of the sample. So those proportional relationships are the changes. That's the cross-cutting concept, the changes. And then that actual temperature, and then looking at particle motion and things like that are parts of the DCI. So those are all kind of baked into this one statement at the top of the standard. And all of these parts of this question are baked into these questions. So all these parts of the standard are baked into these questions where we want students to understand, what the variables are in this investigation. They need to understand how energy is being transferred, and they also need to understand that through the lens of scale, proportion, and quantity. So this is a really interesting question because though it shows a model and it's asking questions about the model, the data tables that are given in the investigation are actually the important part of answering this question later on. So we only have so much space in the slide to show everything on there, but I want to show the model because that's a part of what the question's asking. But the data that is given in the investigation is a really important part of this. That's why this is a planning and carrying investigations standard. And these are the phenomenal questions that we want to build kiddos up to. So we want to see how can we get them up to the point where they're able to answer these three-dimensional, really, really rigorous questions. And so we like to sort of like parse this apart so that when you look at your assessment questions, you can decide, am I asking them A or B? And A is representation. And so what these are ideas that students have previously learned. It's great if you want to give a diagnostic assessment, if you want to see where students are at. If it's a formative assessment, we just talked about this today in class. Tell me if you know this thing. And even though it's helpful for learning development, it's insufficient evidence of proficiency, especially when they're going to be looking at a novel phenomena on the final assessment at the end of the school year. And so that's why we need to have sense-making experiences in our classrooms. So this is where students are explaining why or how to make sense of a novel phenomena. It's important to note that this is not explaining why or how of the thing that we talked about class or of the anchoring phenomena. It's of a new phenomena. So it's really important that students have opportunities to see new things they've never seen before. This is great for a summative assessment. Obviously, you could use this in a diagnostic or formative assessment as well, but oftentimes students are going to really struggle grappling with this, even at the point at the end of a lesson or at the end of a unit where, ideally they should be ready for this. So we like to think about these problems as being more summative in nature. It's master the standard, you're transferring your knowledge, and that's the goal of the NGSS for students to make sense of the world around them. And so that's what we want to prepare students for. But how can we scaffold them up to that point? Okay, we want to take them from understanding the things that we talk about in class to applying that to new things. And that's that final performance right there, that sense-making thing, that's this three-dimensional, rigorous end goal. So what we want students to do at the end to master that standard is to use their knowledge through the lens of the cross-cutting concept or the SEP to explain why or how. And so we'll see two-dimensional and three-dimensional questions on the KSA. So we want to see, okay, so how do we get them up to that point? And what we like to think about is we want to identify the invisible steps that kiddos need to take, and then gather data on each of those steps to see where we can apply our time in the classroom to be most impactful for those kiddos, either in strengthening, areas where they don't need support, but they're on it, or in giving them support in areas where they're struggling. And so what we like to think about are ways that we can scaffold students from this representation into this three-dimensional sense making. And so let's go over the standard one more time before we dive into these questions. But I want you to think about, so we want students to plan investigations, to look at relationships among energy transferred, matter, mass, the change of energy in the particles as measured by a temperature of the sample. And students should understand scale, proportion, quantity, those energy transfer and conservation of energy, and also, parts of planning and carrying out investigations, and specifically designing investigations. That's the important part of this. And so when we think about getting students up to this point, we need to make sure that there's a premise. We need to make sure there's a three-dimensional sense-making task that they are asked to do. So one of our tasks on an orbit is, why do cookies cool at different rates? This always makes me hungry. It doesn't help that I had just some yogurt for lunch. But anyways, so this looks at these different cookies and looking at cookie mass, the starting temperature, the temperature after 1 minute or 3 minutes out of the oven, and looking at the differences in how, the type of matter and the energy that's transferred and the changes that occur, when we adjust those variables. So this is a very tasty investigation that was done to look at how different cookies cool at different temperatures and with at different times and with different masses. And so they all start at 180, but they change to different temperatures after they're out of the oven. So we give students this setup. Here are the following materials that we want to give them. These are really just a list of things for them to include in their final task. And then we give them some data that they can use as well. And so the final question that we want to ask, and we want them to scaffold up to this point, is the sense-making question. So these are our summative, really rigorous questions. This question asks, refer to figure 1 and the materials list, describe a controlled experiment that uses the materials listed, produces the data in figure 2, and helps you determine why some cookies cool faster than others. Identify the following in your experiment. So we want students to explicitly say, what are the variables? What equipment will we use, and how will we use it? And how will we collect data about, throughout the course of this investigation? So we have a list of materials for them to use. So it's not just like, I'm going to use the industrial fryer, but it's very, very specific. And then we have a list of data that we gave them in the experiment, but they get to, use this as kind of like a premise for all of their data as well. And so if we want to get students up to the point where they're answering questions like this, one of the things that we, suggest is that we identify those smaller steps, which are two-dimensional performances. And so we can ask questions about the DCI and the cross-cutting concept. We can ask questions about the DCI and the SEP. And in that way, we can gather data on whether students are struggling with that SEP, that cross-cutting concept, or maybe it's just the DCI, or it's putting them all together in that rigorous performance task. And then we can build those sentence frames. We can build that practice with the SEP or the DCI, or we can say, let's talk about energy transfer and how we measure that. So those are the different steps of the process. So the first question type that we have on an orbit that you can use to build assessments are the core content questions. So we like to think about this at the beginning of the journey. Do students understand the basic elements of energy transfer and definitions of energy? And so in this case, we ask students, what would happen if the oven temperature was raised to 180 to 200 degrees Fahrenheit in the experiment? And so we just need them to understand that, when there's additional thermal energy being applied, that there's going to be an additional energy that's transferred to the cookies, and likely at a faster rate. So this, maybe you could make an argument there's some proportional relationships here, but mostly what we're looking to do is just say that's what energy is. And you can measure it by how you can measure the amount of energy that's being transferred by how quickly things change, like the average kinetic energy of the particles. And so this is just a DCI only question. Just, do you know these things? And if students know these things, then we can move on to the next level. And so these are going to be two-dimensional questions. These are in no particular order. So you can ask the DCI and SEP questions. We call these now content and practices questions. So we can say, which of the following correctly identifies the independent and dependent variable in this investigation? So students need to, in order to access this question, they need to understand what temperature is and what the mass of the cookies are. So that's really, really important. If they don't understand those things, they're not going to be able to access that content or this question at all. So this question specifically gets at the definitions of energy and also planning and investigations, deliberately leaving out the cross-cutting concept because we're going to revisit it in this question, which is a content and concepts question. So these questions ask about the two dimensions, either the DCIs, the content, and then the cross-cutting concepts, the CCCs. So in this case, we ask, which of the following best describes the relationship between the variables in the experiment? Now, we're not just talking about identifying those variables, but explaining conceptually how the variables are related. And so this is the proportional relationships. It's scale, proportion, and quantity. This is the proportional relationship part of that cross-cutting concept. And so we ask students to to note, how the Manado affects the transfer of energy, and that's kind of like what we're looking to. And it's the sort of like loss of heat energy of each of those samples, or retention of heat energy, depending on which way you're looking at this. So in this way, we ask them only about the DCI and the cross-cutting concept together. We don't need to know about the SEP. We just want to build them towards, okay, are you ready to apply the cross-cutting concept? Do you understand this proportional relationships? Or, do you have that SEP understanding? And if they do, and we want to just give them one more level before they get up to that full response question, we can ask a sense-making three-dimensional multiple choice question. So these are the rigorous multiple choice questions that we have on the site that are kind of like one step below those free response questions. So this question says, a student designed an experiment that determines if the number of cakes that are in the oven at the same time affects the time they need to bake. Sounds like a smart kid making lots of different cakes for me to eat. Trial A had 1 cake in the oven, and trial B had 3 cakes. The oven temperature was kept constant at 350 degrees Fahrenheit. Which of the following are expected results of this experiment? And so we want students to, to understand scale, proportion, and quantity. We want them to understand conservation of energy and planning characteristications, and all of those things will allow them to access this question, which is a great precursor to that free response question that we give them in one of the first slides that we went over. And so in that way, we're able to scaffold students from their understanding of core content and the representation of that, application of that core content with a practice or with the cross-cutting concept, and then finally, sense-making three-dimensional questions that get at those 2 DCIs that are sort of like woven into the standard, the SEP, and the cross-cutting concept all together as one. And that can come from a multiple choice question or a free response question. So either one is super duper helpful in determining where students are at. And so with that, I'm really excited to pass it over to Julia to walk us through how we might be able to use phenomena for test prep, maybe in less formal ways than we just went over through those scaffolded questions. Julia, to you.
Thank you. So as Brendan just said, we've gone over the different types of questions that scaffold up to sense making. Now we're going to review some strategies that we could use for test prep across the school year so that our students actually get used to transferring that knowledge to novel phenomena. So going back to our standard, which was MSBS 3.4, and just to recap, it is asking students to plan an investigation to determine the relationships among the energy transferred, the type of matter, the mass, and the change in average kinetic energy of the particles as measured by the temperature of the sample. So we've mentioned using phenomena in assessment, but how can we give students other opportunities to make sense of phenomena throughout the entire unit? And what are the different types of experiences that we can give them to practice for those rigorous questions? So this is a roadmap of phenomena on the Inner Orbit website. And we would use this throughout the unit that we're talking about right now. So in the very beginning, we could start with this phenomena discussing how can we decide which ice cubes are the coolest. So since we're still in the beginning of the unit, we would consider a lower stake discussion like a whole class walkthrough. And this is all about comparing different types of ice cube alternatives to test their effectiveness. And we would include discussion questions maybe that target the cross-cutting concepts and the SCPs for the whole class to answer together. Then moving on to the middle of the unit, we could talk about how energy makes this metal uncoil. So in this case, we would separate the class maybe in groups to answer questions collaboratively in a printed scaffolded group phenomena exploration. So students would discuss the impact of heat energy on the behavior of coiled metal. And in this stage, students are answering rigorous questions that target the DCIs, the cross-cutting concepts, and the SCPs, but with scaffolding from the teacher and support from their group. And then lastly, we could assess students by building a short online assessment. And this can be administered individually. Here we would cover how can we help our teachers, keep their coffee warm. So when we compare different solutions for thermal insulation, this is what we see here. And in this final part of the unit, students should be able to engage with rigorous sense-making questions. So teachers can still provide scaffolding if they want to, but removing those scaffolds is very, very important for building student independence at the end of the day and building confidence towards these sense-making questions. And at this point, we have plenty of phenomena for this physical science standard. but maybe our students are not there yet, and they're starting at a level where they need more phenomena and they need even lower level phenomena in order to access these rigorous things. So what we would do in this situation is that we would go back a grade level to a prior grade level standard. In this case, we would go to this 4th grade standard where students have to apply scientific ideas to design, test, and refine a device that converts energy from one form to another. So same thing, we would look at a road for phenomena, and we could first discuss how emergency radios keep us safe. And this is all about how crank radios are able to use the twisting of a crank to create enough electrical energy to power a radio for emergencies. And then we would consider a comparison maybe of different emergency lights to use in a power outage. And then lastly, we could ask students to analyze how solar cars are able to convert light energy into potential energy, electrical potential energy. So just to sum up, using phenomena for test prep, the main takeaways, first of all, practice makes perfect. And we should be using phenomena throughout all units, not necessarily only during test prep season. And using phenomena provides more opportunities for students to model and practice transferring knowledge and sense making. And if students are struggling with phenomena targeting their grade level band, we can always lower the stakes with a prior grade. So to give further sense making opportunities, we could always do that and identify possible gaps in knowledge or in skills that we still need to go over. So another strategy we could use are these daily do nows. And these are quick daily activities to review prior standards and to gain experience with novel phenomena. So we would recommend building 1 4-question assessment per week, focusing on 1 performance expectation and 1 phenomena for that whole week. So let's say on Monday, students can annotate the phenomena, and each day's question would build in rigor to scaffold students through a rigorous 3-dimensional question by Friday. And maybe they would submit the assessment on Friday or at the end of the week, but we would build on to that rigor at the end of the day for that sense-making question. And another way that we could use this, another strategy, is for phenomena transfer stations. So this actually came from our work with one of our partner districts in Maryland, where a teacher would print out summative assessments with different phenomena with the same standard for students to explore in groups. And a pro of this is that students can keep seeing the same ideas from different scenarios, and it sparks their curiosity and helps them make deep connections. And we would have formative questions to scaffold students up to a rigorous sense-making question. Some things to consider is that in groups, teacher can assign roles. So one person would read the phenomena and another one would be the recorder, another one would find the evidence, and another one would be the fact checker, and each student would have a role. And we would also recommend that students need to have at least a little bit of preparation before they're ready to put their hands together on this. So it's also important to have a whole class debrief afterwards to make sure we model the process of sense making again to our students one more time. And then finally, we have our SCP practice problems. So these are content agnostic sets of questions that are aligned to the K-12 progressions for the SCPs in elementary, middle, and high school with interesting and relevant phenomena and intentionally leaving out the GCIs and the cross-cutting concepts, focusing only on the SCP to build skilled mastery and target specific growth. So all of these are on the InnoOrbit website if you want to go and take a look at them. And this has been a lot of information in just under 40 minutes. So now I'm going to pass it over again to Brendan to wrap up our webinar and for some next steps.
Yay. Thank you so much, Julia. I really, really appreciate it. So we're excited that we were able to get through all of that. If you haven't had chocolate yet today, you should do that for yourself. And just like our friend Russell here, who's pondering, whether Kevin is a boy or girl. Okay, so thank you all for going through all of that with us. We're really, really excited to be able to support you. If you have not already tried InnoOrbit, Julia will drop links to setting up a pilot and our calendar in the chat. If you are watching this as a recording, then you can click on those links in the description, and we would love to support you with a free pilot. You can always sign up for a trial account to explore InnoOrbit on your own, or you can follow us on social media. We do post these videos on YouTube, so you're going to find lots of recordings, lots of webinars, and other cool content that we are working on as well on YouTube. and subscribe there because we're going to be putting out stuff. So like, I don't know, subscribe so you can get notifications when it comes out. You can also just send us an email, inquiries@interorbit.com, if you have any questions for us and there's anything else we can do to be helpful. But otherwise, thank you all very, very much for being here. We are grateful for you. If you have questions, we're going to hang out and answer questions, but I hope you have a beautiful rest of your day.